right, so welcome everyone. Good afternoon, good morning. We have our panelists today joining us from the US, so good morning to you. We apologize for being too early for you. I mean, that was basically inconvenience for Turkish people here. I'm the chair of the Department of Political Science and International Relations at Bahçeşehir University, and I want to welcome everybody to our foreign policy talks today on 2020 US elections. Well, the US election just ended with, former Vice President Joe Biden winning the presidency over Republican incumbent Donald Trump. So that was actually our purpose, to have this event on this day, waiting for some time for the final results to reach. So the elections just took place in the midst of a pandemic, with the economy reeling. The campaign was long, contentious. We all took our pause and just followed the elections for some long time in different parts of the world. So it's really an important matter for different nationalities and different people living in different countries today. So that's why it's a very timely and very relevant for us to speak of the elections and how the new world order will be after the elections. So we have actually a great panel of experts today who'll cover all these very hard topics, like the new administration, how it's going to deal with a range of foreign policy issues. That the US withdrawal from Afghanistan, Iraq, what's going on in the Middle East, and how will the new administration take care of this, issue. And also just after the elections, as we have seen the European counterparts, we're very happy about the elections, mostly for the sake of the transatlantic relations. So we'll also have some time to talk about this, I guess. And also Turkey-US relations, definitely it's what concerns us here in this part of world. And definitely we'll talk about, range of domestic issues, from pandemic management and, the US democracy, certain political challenges. So we have lots of to talk today, and with this distinguished panel of experts, I want to thank all of you that you're with us here. We have students, we have colleagues, we have guests, from different institutions together with us. And I want to stop here, and I really once again welcome you on behalf of my department and also the Faculty of Economics, Administration and Social Science at Bahçeşehir University. And I just pass it to Sean, to introduce our panelists. And yes, thank you very much, Sean, once again for putting us all together here. That was a great effort that you offered us. Yes, Sean, the floor is yours.
Okay, well, just very briefly with the introduction, so we could get into the meat of this conversation. We have joining us today our friend and colleague, Paulo von Schirach, who's the president of Global Policy Institute in Washington, D.C., and the chair of the Political Science Department at our affiliated university there, Bay Atlantic University. We have Obay Shabander, who is a correspondent for TRT World and an expert all things defense. If I remember correctly, he had a stint as a consultant or directly with the Department of Defense in the United States. And then also joining us is Dr. Candace Archer, who is from the Americans for Financial Reform. That's where she's currently employed, which is I guess you call it a policy center in Washington, D.C. that was founded by Elizabeth Warren. And Candace and I are very old friends. We got our doctorates together. I had to put in a plug for this, from the University of Delaware. We both studied there for our masters and our doctorates. So that's a school that we're going to be touting quite a lot, I think, for the upcoming years, and see what happens with that. And then we also have Dr. Joe Yackley joining us, who has had both a long time connection with Turkey and actually with Bahçeşehir University. His family, part of his family is from Turkey, and graduate of the university, doctor from University of Chicago. And while, if I remember correctly, he was a graduate student, he actually did a sort of a sabbatical or research term at Bahçeşehir University when Bahçeşehir was still in Bahçeşehir, before we had relocated to Beşiktaş. So he's been a friend of ours for quite some time. And that's the panel. And we have a variety of viewpoints, a variety of things that are going to be discussed, and we hope that it is interesting for everyone who is involved. So I'm going to start out talking, just sort of laying out some general ideas and general impressions about the contrast between the Trump administration and the upcoming Biden administration, which I think at this point, the stage, we can say with all confidence is going to happen. And of course, we all expect there to be many changes with respect to a US government under a Biden administration than it has been under a Trump administration, no less in the area of US foreign policy. So, excuse me, I'm having a Pence moment here. There's a fly buzzing around. If it lands, someone tell me.
Pardon, tescili istenen bir marka var.
In any case, so let's take a look at foreign policy. Now, from the beginning of his campaign as president, Donald Trump made clear that his foreign policy was going to be focused on basically two words: America first. And he has done his best, and his staff has done his best to ensure that the foreign policy actions that his administration has taken emphasize what they understand to be an America first policy. It's been characterized by unilateralism, often with confrontation with traditional US allies. There's been actually a lot of surprise in some of the actions that he's done. And there's also been a bit of confusion, because one of the hallmarks of his foreign policy aspect is those who manage foreign policy. We've had a higher than normal personnel turnover in some key positions in the State Department and other aspects of the foreign policy apparatus, whether it's intelligence, defense, or anything involving foreign policy. Some of the key facets of this, one of the most notable facets of this has been his lack of interest in multilateralism. Now, greater and lesser extent, Democratic and Republican administrations have, in fact, fostered and supported a multilateral approach to government, although it's a stronger position in Democratic administrations than it has been in Republican administrations. Until Donald Trump, there was no real hardcore abandonment of US multilateralism and its way that it engages with the rest of the world. Examples of this, for example, when within a couple of days of President Trump take this, he removed the United States from the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is, as most of you know, a trade agreement with a large number of Asian nations. He also removed the United States from, in subsequent months and years, from a number of other international accords, international bodies, sometimes in protest, sometimes in complaint that America wasn't getting a good deal. So, for example, he withdrew from the Iranian agreement, from the Kyoto Protocols, from the United Nations Human Rights Council, from the 2015 Paris Climate Accord. Also, he removed everybody from that, from the United States from that. He took the United States out of UNESCO, the United Nations Relief Work Agency, all of these things that were done under the Trump administration spoke to a lack of interest in multilateralism. Instead, the focus was more on bilateral relationships that were transactional in nature. going one-on-one, just like he would do in the business world. He tried to bring that sensibility or lack of sensibility, depending on your position, to US foreign policy governance. And rather than working together with a multitude of partners, his focus was to just work with one. I would argue that this approach has diminished the United States in the world, in particular because a lot of these institutions and a lot of these agreements where Donald Trump withdrew the United States were things that had been initiated by the United States, however long in the past, essentially withdrawing us from the United Nations system because he was unhappy with how the United States was being received or was not being appreciated within the United Nations, was exactly contrary to our role that has been taking place in the United Nations. I mean, the United States set the groundwork for the growth of the United Nations and supported the development of the United Nations for decades. And now he essentially has withdrawn the United States from any active role in the UN aside from the Security Council. And even that, to a certain extent, has been sidelined. Same thing goes with many of the different agreements. As I mentioned, we had the Iran agreement. There was also the Intermediate Range Nuclear Force Agreement. The Paris Agreement was another one. The Treaty on Open Skies. All of these things that had been initiated in no small part by the United States, meaning the United States helped crafted these, were rejected by Donald Trump, and in favor of him targeting specific countries for specific transactional requirements and specific transactional transactional aims, like you do something for me, I'll do something for you. Multilateralism, to a certain extent, extends a sense of altruism throughout the world, that these countries are all working on behalf of the entire global community and for the betterment of everyone. The Donald Trump's America First policy, the goal was stated right up front very easily: I'm going to do what I think is best for the United States, and all of these things with the United Nations, all of these multilateral agreements, multilateral accords, weakens US sovereignty, weakens US power, and I'm not going to have any of it. So this has probably been the most notable characteristic of Trump's foreign policy. And in doing so, he's damaged to an extent the transatlantic relationship that has grown ever since, especially since World War II. He has damaged relations with other organizations that could support ultimately US goals as it pertains to the environment, security, trade, and whatnot. And honestly, he has this lack of multilateralism has essentially just weakened respect for the United States around the world. So what can we expect from a Biden presidency in terms of foreign policy? Well, there's a lot of cleanup that a Biden administration is going to have to do to actually turn around some of the foreign policy mistakes, if I can use that term, that the Trump administration has made. He's going to have to reaffirm the commitment of the United States to engaging in a multilateral sense with the rest of the world for these large agreements, for example, like the Paris Accords or like the Iran agreement that has multiple actors in it, that we are taking part, we as in the United States are taking part in this, not just to serve our own interests, but to serve overall the interests of the rest of humanity and to support governments and people around the world. Now, when Biden has said that on his first day in office, in backtracking on some of Trump's initiatives, he said that he's going to issue executive orders that will allow the United States to rejoin the Paris Agreement. He was also going to offer to rejoin the 2015 nuclear deal with Iran. if Tehran agrees to return to compliance with the deal. This, once the United States pulled out, Iran, which had been following all of the agreement, all the parts of the agreement, they stopped complying with the agreement because the United States was still imposing sanctions that went against the agreement. Biden has also said that he's going to reaffirm the US commitment to NATO, that he's going to rejoin the World Health Organization, that he is also going to get the United States involved again with different aspects of the United Nations, for example, with UNESCO and the Human Rights Council, as the opportunities present themselves. But the one thing to keep in mind is that while it seems like this will be a return to Obama-era policies, what many pundits are already calling Obama 2.0, because many of the ideas that Biden has are very similar to those that were executed and exercised under Obama's administration. There are even many of the same people that will be brought in. For example, Susan Rice or Tony Blinken are on a number of shortlists for positions in the government. That's not necessarily the case that Biden's foreign policy will be exactly the same as Obama's foreign policy. It's a little deceiving to think that, because while there are all of these changes and retractions that the Biden administration is going to make, there are also some changes that have occurred over the past 4 years that would either prevent Biden from a complete return to Obama-era policies, or maybe, he is a different man than Obama and has different concerns, and the United States has different concerns going into 2021. So, for example, the issue of China, but I'm not going to speak much about that because some of the other panelists will be addressing that. International economic policy, again, one of the other panelists will be discussing that. And these type of policies are likely to be more familiar and have some continuity with Trump-era policies than with Obama-era policies. And like, for example, what's going to be happening in the Middle East. It's likely that Biden will maintain an arm's length relationship with Saudi Arabia, and that it will have harsher treatment, if I can use that word, harsher treatment of some countries that were seen as allies under the Obama administration. But the key thing to remember is that since Joe Biden was vice president serving under the Obama administration, the world has changed. So it's not going to just be dusting off the Obama foreign policy manual. There are going to have to be changes that are going to be introduced that will reflect the realities of 2021 and onwards. So even Tony Blinken, whose name I've mentioned, he served for a very long term as Joe Biden's chief of staff when he was at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, served in the Obama administration. He's the chief foreign policy advisor. He's actually said in several interviews that a Biden administration is going to engage with the world not as it was in 2009, not as it was in 2017 when Trump took over, but as it is now. The only thing that will be different from a Trump administration is the ways in which the Biden administration engages the world will be more reflective of that of an Obama administration than that of a Trump administration. So I have taken up my time, and in order to give my colleagues more time to talk, I'm going to pass the baton as it is over to Dr. Candace Archer. And you have the floor and like 12 to 15 minutes. And Ebru, since I'm already on and actively engaged, I'm going to be doing clock counting, okay?
Thank you.
So, everyone, when you come down to 2 minutes left, I'm going to be putting, well, maybe not. Are there British people? Maybe I should go like that. I'm not sure how I should do that. All right, Candace, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, greetings from Washington, D.C., where it is about 8 o'clock in the morning, where I understand you're all somewhere in the afternoon. So it's wonderful to start my day thinking about how things are going to change, although I do agree with Sean's remarks that there are certain things that aren't really going to change that much. And I think that we see that probably most strongly in the economic policies that have been set up by the Trump administration. So I'm going to talk briefly about sort of three different categories of foreign economic policy. First of all, trade, second, development issues, and then third, financial markets. And what I think we're going to see is that in two of these categories, things aren't going to change that much. And in the third category, things are probably likely to change a little more significantly. I think the overarching theme of everything that I'm going to say, particularly as it relates to trade, is that there is diminished US influence economically, that there is less ability to shape trade and economic relationships, and largely that's because of the turning inward of Trump era policies. And I think that it's going to be very difficult for a Biden administration to then open up again and turn more outward on some of these policies. The second point that I want to make before I get into the specifics is that, you know, Americans are notoriously uninterested in the rest of the world, and they do not vote in elections based on foreign policy. In fact, they often don't know anything about foreign policy. And this has become particularly true over the last 4 years. The Trump administration has drawn so much attention to domestic issues, whether it be, you know, him stoking white supremacy or, you know, his impeachment trials, which did have an international component, but there's been so much attention paid on what are we doing here with this America First model that I think the domestic environment is really driving a lot of what the Biden administration is thinking about. So what that means is that there's probably a little less attention to how the Biden administration is going to set itself up internationally. As you probably know, as a senator, Biden was probably one of our most well-versed foreign relations experts in the Senate. And as vice president, he continued being very active in foreign policy. So in that sense, you know, we know that it's something that he has cared about for many years and finds incredibly important. So let me take on each one of these topics individually. Probably the most significant topic that the Trump administration has dealt with over the last 4 years has been trade. Trump's trade policy has echoed the theme that Sean talked about, which is America First. And since at least part of his electoral base was manufacturing employees in the Midwest, sort of what we would call the blue collar Rust Belt, he has at least made a lot of statements that he was instituting foreign policies on economic that were to help those populations. I think the reality is he didn't do that, but he used that America First mantra as a way to really disrupt trade relations and villainize a lot of countries around the world. I think if you had to describe Trump's trade policy, you'd have to call it chaotic and sporadic. It seems largely to have been driven by personal vendettas and was kind of inconsistent with policies that were actually effective in terms of helping American industries or American agriculture. A lot of his policy was targeting China, and he did that with very significant tariffs, and so much so that China retaliated and pretty much threw many of our agricultural markets into a tailspin, at which point the Trump administration created an enormous subsidy program to support farmers who are losing an enormous amount of money from their trade with China. In addition to targeting China, Trump was opposed to trade deals for the most part, especially multilateral ones. He weakened and removed the US from trade deals. Probably the most significant is the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, something that was started under the Obama era and received a lot of criticism, particularly from manufacturing bases in the United States and labor. But Trump just ended the relationships, ended those negotiations. From the United States perspective, the negotiations did continue. He ended up in trade wars and with poor relationships in Europe. And largely this played out through the World Trade Organization. The European Union had several disputes that it brought before the World Trade Organization and received an enormous amount of retaliatory tariffs as a result of the U.S. being found guilty of some of those charges. And he had poor relationships across the board with international organizations and specifically the World Trade Organization. And so that's sort of, you know, what he set up. On the American continent, the North and South American continents, many of those same dynamics played out. We had a more contentious relationship with both Canada and Mexico, our two largest trading partners, and that led to the renegotiation of NAFTA into a new North American trade pact, which was considered to be friendlier to U.S. interests, although the actual changes were more rhetoric than reality. But for a while, we were really squeezing both Mexico and Canada in terms of our trade relationships to force them into a situation of renegotiating that deal. So that is sort of, you know, the overall picture. Just to give you a little glimpse of what this meant with Turkey, you probably have a sense of that already. But with Turkish, the trade relationship regarding steel was particularly bad. There are enormous tariffs on Turkish steel, and that was sort of the industry that was most targeted between our two countries. The Biden administration, I think, will be more predictable. I don't think that there will be a lot of name calling with China. What I do think is that the Trump administration moved forward an isolationist and protectionist trade policy that is going to be very hard to shake off, particularly because the Democratic Party has always been less in favor of market relationships and more in favor of relationships that benefit our workers and our industries. So what has been set up is a new wave of protectionist measures that I think will continue. The rhetoric around them will just probably be a little bit different. So in some ways, Trump has served up, and this is sort of the complicated nature of his presidency. He served up a lot of policies that Democrats, you know, were critical. Democrats were very critical of the Obama administration, how far it had gone toward free trade. And Trump was able to generate some attention on that to get people to vote for him, and then delivered on these protectionist policies, at least in terms of rhetoric. So I think it's going to be very difficult for Biden to back away from those protectionist measures. However, I do think that his administration is going to be far more predictable. He's going to have better relationships with all of our trading partners, especially the European Union, and there's going to be more emphasis on multilateral efforts. Here's the problem, though. Once you step away from the table, it doesn't mean the trade deals have stopped. So the TPP is something that we have removed ourselves from, but it has been negotiated essentially, and it's been negotiated with China as the leading voice in the room. So that deal doesn't quite look like what we would have thought it would look like, and there's really no way for the Americans to get back into it now. I mean, we can try, we can, you know, have more amenable relations, but we weren't at the table, deals were made, and it's hard to get back in. And I don't think that that we're going to be able to redo some of this damage. It's really hard to go back on the trade and economic relationships. I do think that the Biden administration is going to have a really new emphasis that we have not seen very much in trade relationships. You may recall all the way back to the Clinton administration when when Clinton came into power, he said that he was going to trade with China on a human rights agenda. That's how he was going to engage with China. If they didn't do the right things in human rights, he wasn't going to allow them into markets. I think what we're likely to see with a Biden administration is an emphasis on climate, that there will be what are being called carbon adjustment fees, which are essentially tariffs put on countries that refuse to be part of climate improvement measures. So I think that we're going to see protectionism and tariffs are just going to be kind of tied to different things, just like we saw in previous administrations tied to human rights or other issues. He is making an enormous pitch for everyone in his domestic cabinet, everyone in the domestic agencies, in the executive branch, every agency will deal with climate change in some way, shape, or form. And I can imagine that that's going to extend to foreign policy as well. Those things are often not very successful. We tend to have trade relationships regardless of whether countries violate human rights or climate protocols, but we'll see how far he's able to get with that agenda. And then finally on trade, I think that the relationship the United States has with the World Trade Organization is going to be is going to be changing as well. And hopefully it means that we will get back in and start talking more about dispute resolution. I've spent most of my time on trade, but I do want to briefly cover development and international finance. Regarding development, I think that you're likely to see a re-engagement in many of the agencies that deal with development at the United Nations. Trump had famously said, used an explicative to talk about developing countries and dismiss them in general. I do not think that this is going to be what the Biden administration does. I do think there's going to be a turn toward trying to especially focus on Latin America, but mostly I think development will be done through UN agencies as it has been before, and re-engaging with some of those agencies is going to be how the Biden administration will do that. In terms of finance or financial markets, largely US policy has been focused on free market interactions. Regardless of the administration, we do not necessarily control financial interactions. And what we have seen since 2008 domestically is that there's been more interest in regulating financial markets because of the housing crisis, the 2008 financial crisis. The Trump administration came in and dismantled most of those regulations. And I think the Biden administration will most likely re-regulate on financial markets and Wall Street and some of the financial issues that we see domestically. Internationally, this may have an effect. It might have some effects on US economic actions. I think the Fed is likely to keep interest rates low. I do want to point out sort of like an interesting thing that's happened over the last few days, which may be over and may not. The Trump administration is trying to appoint people to the Federal Reserve, which is our central bank, that the woman he's trying to appoint does not believe that the US should have a central bank, first of all, and second of all, believes that the United States should go back to the gold standard. These are terms that are appointed through presidency. So if Trump can get her appointed in the current lame duck session, she is likely to be on the board through the Biden administration into whatever administration comes next. So there are still some weird things that could happen in terms of finance and how we approach the system. But I do anticipate that it won't be that different from what we've seen in the past, which is that capital markets are essentially free markets and have been since the 1970s. So I think that the most important thing, the most important areas that we're going to see changes in with the Biden administration are trade relations. And I think that the one thing that we can almost guarantee is that the relationships will be far more predictable, far less drama tied to them, and that over the last 4 years, the United States has really missed opportunities to help and shape trade relationships that we'll never get back. So, thank you.
Thank you, Candace. All right, moving on. Ubay, you're up.
All right, I've successfully unmuted myself, so far so good. First of all, greetings everyone, marhablar, and privyet from Azerbaijan. I'm speaking to you from a city in called Ganja, which interestingly enough has been the past 400 years at the epicenter of conflict between 3 separate empires, the Persian, the Ottoman, of course the Russian Empire. And so what better place than here to talk about the impact of American foreign policy on the region and the world, and particularly with the upcoming Biden administration expected to take place. Well, let me begin actually with the issue of Azerbaijan and Karabakh and American foreign policy, since I'm here. I've been on the ground here for the past week, observing and reporting and filming a documentary on the conflict and the post-conflict period here in the South Caucasus. And it was very interesting and perhaps telling that this issue actually was raised in one of the in the presidential debates, and we saw at least 2 statements from President-elect Biden on Azerbaijan, the issue of Karabakh, of course, coming strongly on the side of Armenia. The Trump administration, beyond a short, terse statement from Secretary of State Pompeo, has largely stayed out of the South Caucasus, and particularly the Karabakh conflict and the 6-week war that resulted in Azerbaijan's essentially decisive military victory, leading to a ceasefire peace deal with Armenia that has largely returned most of the land that Azerbaijan lost to Armenia from 1993. So the American response here, of course, from a foreign policy perspective, has been muted. Of course, in other parts of the South Caucasus, such as Georgia, where Secretary of State Pompeo is, I believe, right now. No, he was there yesterday. States like Georgia have looked to the U.S. As a security guarantor against Russian incursions, and of course, we've seen Georgia really attempting to try to convince NATO to do more. And interestingly enough, we have a NATO country, Turkey, very heavily engaged in Azerbaijan, with Turkish F-16s deployed to Azerbaijan as a strategic deterrent against essentially anything that Russia might do. So America's approach towards NATO is going to very much reverberate with America's bilateral relationship with Turkey and with security equities here in the South Caucasus. And I think that's really important, something for us to keep an eye out on whether or not some of the campaign rhetoric from the Biden camp will translate into foreign policy action. And I might note that often is not the case. If we've seen historically that presidential candidates during a campaign period will tend to take a much more hawkish approach and then move a little to the center once they take office, except for President Trump. He did exactly what he said when he was running for president, and that was perhaps shocking to the world. But I think we may return back to a more standard model of foreign policy with President Biden. And of course, U.S. foreign policy towards Turkey. How's that going to be impacted? Let's talk about that. Interestingly enough, while of course, the Trump administration very much devalued multilateralism, but very much valued a very traditional or style of personal relations, where a significant portion of U.S. foreign policy was based on the personal relationship that President Trump had with his counterparts. Of course, that is not necessarily, a revolutionary dynamic, and we've seen foreign policies throughout American history, whether it's a Republican or Democrat in power, being colored or largely shaped by the personal relations between the American president and his counterpart. But perhaps more so than ever with President Trump, that personal relationship factor has been much more impactful. And given that President Trump had a very warm and very direct relationship with President Erdogan, as well as other leaders in the region, it'll be very interesting to see on whether or not President Biden takes a similar approach. Now, that probably is what's going to really perhaps shift the way America's foreign policy vis-a-vis Turkey as the Biden administration ramps up in the coming year. There's probably, my prediction, there's probably going to be some painful episodes in the American bilateral relationship with Turkey once President Biden takes office. President Trump, frankly, has done a lot for example, from stopping CAATSA sanctions from being fully implemented, to slow rolling congressional efforts to pass sanctions against Turkey. So it'll be interesting whether or not a President Biden, who has a lot of power in the executive, how much support he gives for the implementation of CAATSA sanctions, which could have a very severe impact on the Turkish economy. So that's something to really look out for. And I think that Turkey will be really high on the list of a Biden presidency's foreign policy challenges and priorities, given American equities in Syria and Iran. I want to talk about Iran real quick. I'm going to try to keep my remarks as short as possible so we can have more times for the Q&A session. I think we can comfortably predict that the Biden administration will go back to the JCPOA. The question, which is the Iran nuclear deal. I mean, we've seen, if there's been any topic that Biden senior advisors have written more op-eds about, it has been op-eds critical of the Trump administration pulling out of the nuclear deal with Iran. That, I think, is going to be a huge priority for the Biden administration, and that will have ripple effects on the Biden foreign policies and Biden bilateral relations with Turkey and other Arab states and Israel in the region. So we have to really also we could see a sea change in American foreign policy with regards to Iran. But as Sean has pointed out, a lot has changed since 2016 with Iran, particularly with the sunset clauses that were written into the JCPOA, and with Iran's expansion militarily through the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iraq and Syria, and where the American troop presence remains. We have, of course, seen, on that topic, we've of course seen now the new acting Secretary of Defense, Scott Miller. He has a month and a half left, and he's going to do a lot. We have seen an official order from President Trump and the new acting Secretary of Defense to draw down American troop numbers in Iraq and Afghanistan and Syria, although not to zero. So it'll be my prediction is that you will see a Biden administration attempt to slow roll any more future drawdowns, perhaps even increasing American troop levels in Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan. And that, of course, would also be a sea change in American foreign policy. And since the U.S. president is the commander-in-chief and has a significant amount of power particularly when it comes to military and foreign policy affairs in the Office of the Executive. These are areas in American foreign policy that the President Biden could easily and swiftly reverse. So I think that's going to be another major issue. When it comes to China, interestingly, I think that Biden it'll be very difficult politically for Biden to ease off on China. That Trump, in that sense, has outmaneuvered Biden. In fact, even during the campaign, the presidential campaign, we've seen Biden maneuver himself to be a hawk on China. So it'll be, although while the rhetoric may ease up vis-a-vis Biden and China or Washington and Beijing, I think we could very much see a Biden administration taking a hard line with China, particularly when it comes to areas such as the South China Sea and Taiwan. I think the Biden approach is going to be perhaps very much similar to the Trump administration's approach in that regards as well. And I'm going to stop right there so we can get to, and so we can have as much time as we can on the Q&A. And I hope you guys ask me a lot about Syria and Azerbaijan.
All right, Ubay, thank you very much. And you came in under time too. Excellent. That's what we like. All right, next, Paulo, you've got the floor.
All right, many thanks, and again, thanks to all of you. Thank you, Sean. Thank you to Bahçeşehir University for organizing this event, and I'm pleased to be able to offer my perspective here. So I agree with much of what has already been said, and in particular, I would like to tie in with the last the tail end of Kubay's remarks, and this is China. I know you are in Azerbaijan. It's you got a different perspective there, and when there is a crisis and fighting and dying, things are kind of raised in the general perspective. But let's look at the big picture here. If I may just say, Joe Biden comes in as let's admit it, he's going to be a weak president. Okay, I know this is not come. Oh my God, really? He won? Oh, come on. He's a weak president because he has no coattails. The Democratic majority in the House has dwindled pathetically to almost nothing, because the general perception in the United States is that the Democratic Party has moved too far to the left. I mean, right or wrong, it doesn't matter. That's the perception. And clearly, many people who voted for Biden, voted so because they were just fed up with Trump and his bizarre way of managing the country. It remains to be seen whether the Democrats may gain the slimmest majority, eventually, of one seat, thanks to the tiebreaker vote of the vice president, assuming they win both seats in the upcoming second round of elections in Georgia, which will take place in January 5th. And that's it's a possibility, but certainly not a given. So either you will have a majority of one in the Senate, that's the best case scenario, or a continuing slim but significant majority, Republican majority in the Senate. That means that the Republicans will control the agenda, even if it's by one vote. And that's not helpful to Biden. More broadly, nationwide, nothing much has happened to turn around American politics. Most governors are still Republicans. The Republicans have made inroads in state houses, et cetera, et cetera. I don't want to go too long on this, but what I'm just trying to offer here is some perspective. The perspective is that this has been a personal victory of Mr. Biden, clearly, and I don't think there's any misunderstanding about this. He wins the popular vote by more than 5 million votes, but this is an anti-Trump vote, not a rejection of a Republican agenda as, in total. Now, as it's been pointed out, the conduct of American foreign policy under Trump has been chaotic. There's no agenda. Yes, America first, this and that, but it's chaos. It's chaos. I would invite you, if you haven't done it yet, to read John Bolton's book. And you have an understanding of how the policymaking process was organized, or rather was not organized, was utter chaos from day to day, the complete inability to stay on the subject, to focus on anything for more than 5 minutes. And so hopefully now that the adults come back into the room, and obviously Biden and his advisors, I would call them adults, if nothing else, maybe, you know, whatever their instincts and how can I say, and predilections policy-wise may be, but there will be process. There will be an orderly way of handling issues. I think perhaps on that we can all agree. But let me repeat what I said before. This is not an administration that comes in with a huge mandate to do anything at all, except to restore a sense of calm in the country. This is what Americans voted for, normalcy. It's not a very high bar to reach, and it's surprising that the focus of an election is let's throw out a bizarre, confused person and let's put in somebody who at least is sane. That's been fundamentally the focus of this election. And Mr. Biden has been, in a sense, lucky, and I hate to say this, but because of COVID, because he could manage to focus on the mishandling of the COVID pandemic by Trump, and that's probably what got him over the edge. So, but be that as it may, this is kind of contextual. When it comes to the management of foreign policy by a new Biden administration, my sense is that regardless of all these other elements of the agenda, that everything is important. There's this, there's that, there's the Middle East, there's Iran, you know, there's NATO, et cetera, et cetera. But in a kind of bizarre way, what Trump has managed to do, and I don't think this was deliberate. I don't think he was intentional, because I don't ascribe to him the ability to have a long-term vision about anything. But what he has managed to do, by accident more than by design, has been to force the focus of most of the American elites on China. I thought it was interesting, you know, a few months ago, there was a good column, as they usually are, by Tom Friedman in the New York Times. And I think the headline was, Trump is the president China deserves. All right, I repeat, Trump is the president China deserves. No, we don't deserve it. We're unlucky domestically because of Trump, but China deserves Trump because he's a disruptor and because he has pointed the attention on their systemic malfeasance. China is going to be the #1 American headache for a generation, I would think. This replaces the Cold War. Again, not in the same dynamics, not the same drivers, but let me elaborate. I think the consensus in Washington, and this unites in a strange way Democrats and Republicans, is that China is up to rewriting the rules, not just of the world, you know, economic order, which clearly they're intent on doing, but there was intent on doing so with a relentless, all-out effort to dominate in the technologies of the future. In other words, they realize that a great deal of the American strength in world affairs is technological preeminence. We have been the hub, you know, the innovation lab, so to speak, for practically all the major technologies of the 20th and 21st century. What China says is, you want to rule the world, you've got to be the leader in technology, set the standards, and force the world to adopt your standards. And this is really what China is up to. And it's doing so using legitimate and all sorts of illegitimate tools. We know what they are: hacking, stealing, you know, stealing intellectual property, mercantilism. You know, there's a host and a panoply of tools that China, intimidation, that China has been using and will continue to use. And so here's the challenge for a Biden administration. Are we just going to look at this unfold, or are we going to do something about it? Let me just mention something, because purely by accident, it happens to be in today's Wall Street Journal. And I quote, this is a report coming from the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which of course at the moment is run by Republicans, right? And this is a quote from Jim Risch, the chairman. "It is our populations, the US and Europe, that built the world order of today, not China," said Senator Jim Risch, the chairman of the Senate committee, in an interview. "The world order that we have, based on democracy and based on the rule of law, is where the planet should go if it's going to have a future." This is not a small statement. This is, we wrote the rules of the game. We want a rules-based international order which reflects free markets and democracy. This is the Republican chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee about a report which has not yet been released on China. And here is the echo from the Biden people. Andrew Bates, a spokesman for the Biden transition team, said, "President-elect Biden agrees that we should stand together with our allies and partners to press China's government to curtail its economic, human rights, and other abuses. Stand together with our allies." So here is the variation, the Biden variation on the anti-China policy. We have to rebuild our relations with the allies. We cannot do this alone. The most, how can I say, tragic strategic blunder of President Trump has been to do this, to try to do this all alone, meaning attack China, at the same time attacking Europe, attacking Japan, attacking South Korea, and making a mess of everything. There is no united front. We're not in agreement. There's no concerted effort. There's no coordination. There's no nothing. And so the value of a, if I don't know, for lack of a better word, I would say a China containment policy is vastly diminished by the inability to create a united front under President Trump. And I think this vastly diminished the impact and effectiveness of any effort at curtailing Chinese ambitions and efforts to dominate the world. I think we can expect from a Biden, that in a Biden administration, there will be an effort domestically to forge a bipartisan consensus. And I believe the pieces are there to create, to be all on the same page, to say this is not about a trade imbalance. This is about a long-term strategic threat by an anti-system player in the international political system whose objective is not to compete, but to replace. I repeat, China's objective is not to compete with the United States, is to create a new world order, which is Sino-centric. And I think that this is not a small thing. And again, maybe you say, oh, come on, that's a bit of a strong statement. I don't think so. The fundamental difference between now, what's happening now and the Cold War, is that during the Cold War, the Soviet Union could throw into the balance its nuclear weapons and conventional forces. The 30, Red Army divisions that were in East Germany, were the tools of Soviet foreign policy. What China has is a lot more. China is now the second largest economic power in the world. It's still growing, although there's a lively debate here in Washington as to the actual strength of China. Some actually say, you know what, it's mostly smoke and mirrors. Whatever that is.
2 minutes, Paulo.
Whatever that is, thank you. The efforts of China to dominate the world are there. And I think this is something that both Democrats and Republicans are keenly aware of. Mark Warner, senator from Virginia, is the ranking member in the Senate Intelligence Committee right now, in the outgoing Senate, and one of the fiercest critics of China. He's a Democrat, okay? And not a particularly ideological one. So I just point this up to your attention so that we contextually can all understand all this. In this context, rebuilding relations with Europe and NATO and resolving disputes such as Airbus Boeing, which has been really poisoning the bilateral relationship for many years, is of paramount importance. And I think we can count, as others have said already, and you, Sean, mentioned it, warmer relations with Berlin and London and Paris and Rome, whatever, is high on the agenda of a new Biden administration, as is strengthening relations with Tokyo and Seoul and Australia, and potentially, getting India to join an Indo-Pacific anti-China front. So for me, these are by far the most important issues. That doesn't mean that the others, Iran and other things, will not be discussed, but strategically, stand ready for a long slug, a long confrontation with China. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Paulo. So closing it out is Joe. You've got it.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sean and Ebru, for organizing and for inviting me. As Sean mentioned, I was a fellow at Bahçeşehir back in the day, so it's nice to be back, so to speak, virtually, that is. At the outset, I want to stress that I'm sharing my personal opinions here. I know we all are, but I'm currently assigned here to Turkey as a diplomat with the US Department of State. So my opinions should not be understood as any official statement by the US government anyway. These are just my own personal thoughts. I'll keep my initial comments brief so we can get to the Q&A, which is always the most interesting part. But I did want to make two broad points. The first being, I wanted to offer a kind of alternative account of this election from what I've seen in international news media. I'm not trying to offer alternative facts, rather just an alternative view. And then I'd like to take a few minutes to consider what the results of this election say about the electoral and demographic trends of the United States. So I'll be shifting the conversation a bit away from foreign policy to domestic issues. Don't get me wrong, I relish a good debate about foreign policy, but as a member of the diplomatic corps posted abroad, I do subscribe to the adage that our politics should stop at the water's edge. So I'll confine my comments today to the domestic sphere. And I'll be the first to acknowledge that American elections suffer from several shortcomings. But that said, I was struck by how misguided I felt some foreign criticism of this election has been. Sitting here in Turkey, I noticed two particularly glaring misconceptions. The first being that this was an utterly chaotic election, and the second that this election somehow is proof positive of the decline of American democracy. As evidence of the chaotic nature of this election, many analysts were citing the time it took to call the election for Joe Biden. But obviously there were several complicating factors in this election. First, as always, America's federal system and the Electoral College mandate that we essentially hold more than 50 separate elections, each with its own rules and regulations, and that we then, after each of these individual elections are held, aggregate the results. Second, this election did involve several close races in very pivotal states. Obviously, this wouldn't matter if we held a nationwide election. I think even going into the election, it was understood that Joe Biden was going to win nationwide, but we needed to run these 50 separate elections and then tally up the votes according to the Electoral College. Third, unique to this election, we witnessed the highest voter turnout in history, which many pundits have pointed to as a sign that American democracy is not in decline. Participation is obviously not the only measure of the democratic system, but that is a positive development for the United States. Obviously, this year there was also an unprecedented number of mail-in ballots because of COVID-19. And the Trump administration going into the election had sued to ensure that these ballots wouldn't be or couldn't be prepared in advance. And this delayed the count considerably. This was, of course, by design, but had these ballots been counted on election day, prepared beforehand, it's pretty clear at this point that the networks would have been able to call the election for Biden within hours rather than days. And networks also admitted that they were hesitant to call the election. Perhaps, there were scars from the 2000 election. I think it probably has more to do with the very heated nature of the campaign this year. So despite all of these pretty unique circumstances, this election was called less than 4 days after the polls closed. I was sitting at home watching this. I actually tested positive for coronavirus a few days before. So I consumed TV 16, 17 hours a day for those 4 days. So it felt like an eternity. But in retrospect, given all these circumstances, I don't think 4 days is actually all that long. The second misconception that I noticed in the coverage was that somehow this election proves that American democracy is in decline. As evidence, a lot of Turkish news agencies had cited President Trump's allegations of voter fraud or his refusal to concede the election. The first thing to note is that these allegations are totally unfounded and that there is no credible evidence of voter fraud on any meaningful scale. Just a couple days ago, the director of cybersecurity at the Department of Homeland Security had described this election as the most secure election in American history. As we're aware, he was fired for that comment just a day later. However, it was a very secure election. So there is no evidence of voter fraud on any meaningful scale. Second, Trump's refusal to concede this election is a choice that Trump made. This is not a sign of a systemic problem with America's electoral system. This is Trump's refusal. This is more a comment, in my opinion, on Trump than it is a comment on the state of American democracy. And then third, there's been obviously numerous legal challenges that have thankfully all been dismissed by the courts for lack of evidence, because I think it's actually interesting to note that when the sitting president, the most powerful individual in the country, is held to the same evidentiary standards as everyone else in the country, I think that's a good sign. And it not only is a sign of an independent judiciary, but it's also a sign of a resilient democracy. Fourth, I've also noticed that the stock market is at all-time highs over the last couple of weeks, which suggests that there's no widespread panic, at least in the markets, about what this election or the debate about the election means in terms of the resilience of American institutions. Now, granted, there are problems with American elections. Of course there are. I have issues with the money in campaigns and the length of the campaigns. The two-party system is not ideal, in my opinion. Obviously, gerrymandering, the Electoral College, issues of voter suppression, these are all serious issues, but these are not unique to this particular election. And I don't really feel like this was the focus of the coverage of the election this time around in international media. So in this election, despite the unique and significant challenges that were posed by Donald Trump's campaign and the legal challenges and the COVID-19 pandemic, I think everyone here will acknowledge that in all likelihood, Joe Biden will be sworn in as president as scheduled on January 20th. Now let me shift gears a little bit and assess what I think these results mean for domestic US politics. I agree with a lot of what Pablo said in his opening. I think it's fair to say that Joe Biden won the presidency in this election, but the Democrats actually lost the election overall. First, Biden's victory was quite decisive. He won the Electoral College by a total of 306 to 232. As many are aware, this is the exact same result as the quote unquote landslide election that Trump described winning in 2016. However, unlike Trump in 2016, Biden won the popular vote by 5%. So this was by American electoral standards, a very significant victory. This is significant, or similar, I should say, to Obama's victory in 2008. It's also similar to Bill Clinton's margin of victory in 1996. And it's important to note that Biden actually did this against an incumbent candidate, which I think is a pretty remarkable accomplishment. Now, to my second point about the fact that I think the Democrats actually lost the election, of course, the Democrats won the big prize, the presidency. But given the pandemic and the struggling economy and the heightened sensitivity over race relations, in addition to a deeply unpopular president whose poll numbers never really went above 45% throughout his 4-year term, many people, many analysts expected a blue wave election. no one talked about a red wave, obviously. The Democrats expected to expand their majority in the House of Representatives. They actually lost 6 seats. As Paolo mentioned, they also failed to win the Senate. Obviously, we had the 2 runoffs in Georgia. If they win both of those, there'll be a tiebreaker, which the Democrats would win with Kamala Harris as the vice president. But in all likelihood, they won't win those 2 Georgia Senate runoffs, and the Democrats will be in the minority. Republicans were also defending more seats this time around. They had to defend 23 seats, while the Democrats only had to defend 12. And then I noticed in the Cook political report, of the 7 Senate seats that were deemed to be a toss-up in this election, Republicans ended up winning 5 of those 7, the last 2 being the 2 runoffs in Georgia that have yet to be decided. Importantly, Republicans also gained ground in state legislatures, giving them a real advantage for redistricting based on the 2020 census that will last 10 years. Something also that's, I think, interesting is that down ballot Republicans did quite a bit better than Trump. So there was some, as I say, ticket splitting going on, which suggests that this was really a vote against Trump more than it was a vote for the Democrats. I also see some disturbing trends if I were a member of the Democratic National Committee. I think it's still early and people are still sifting through the data, but we can draw a few conclusions from the exit polls and the early data. The biggest factors in how people voted, consistent with previous elections, remain geography, race, and gender. On geography, the rural-urban divide that has marked previous elections has actually grown stronger. I don't think this is great for the Democrats, even though America is increasingly an urban society, but this does dilute Democrats' power in the Senate and in the Electoral College because of the tendency to concentrate support in these cities. The bright spot in this election for the Democrats was that suburban voters did turn out strongly against Trump. I don't think, however, that the Democrats can really count on the suburbs going forward. I think this was unique to Trump in this election. On race remains in the United States highly indicative of voter preference. Trump did gain among minority voters, especially in Hispanics, and this was very important for his victory in Florida as well as Texas. On gender, Trump did lose support among women, but I think, again, this was particular to Trump. I don't think this is necessarily a long-term trend that Democrats can count on going forward. One thing that I think stood out in this election more than in most elections, perhaps similar to 2016, was that there's an emerging fault line in American politics with education. Increasingly, the Democrats are becoming the party of the so-called educated elite, while Republicans gained even more support than they did in 2016 among the white working class. And if this trend holds going forward, this would represent a profound shift in American politics. I think this has a lot to do with the decline of labor unions, which reliably supported Democrats for decades and were incredibly important to organizing get out the vote campaigns for Democrats. And I think this was the major reason why Trump won in the Rust Belt back in 2016 and why Biden only narrowly won in states like Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania this time around. Some people think this trend is particular to Donald Trump, but I'm not so sure about that. And then I think I'll just wrap up my comments with a word of advice, particularly to the political science students out there who are listening in, and that is to stay humble. It's always easier to look back at an election and make comments. As we saw, the pundits were, in the polls, were off by a large margin this time around. They were off by more in 2020 than they were in 2016, despite having supposedly learned a lot of elections about their polling methodology. And going back a little further, I think we'll all remember the Republican autopsy after the 2012 election when Romney lost to Obama. The argument there by the Republican National Committee was that unless Republicans can learn to appeal more to minority voters, that the demographic trends practically guaranteed that Democrats would win the presidency in every election going forward. Several editorials made this same argument. I should know, I actually wrote one of those editorials myself. And obviously Trump proved this autopsy wrong. I would note, if we look at the Electoral College and the general population of the United States, this does hold true. The Democrats have won, I think it's now 7 of the last 8, perhaps 8 of the last 9 popular votes in the presidential election. But obviously that is not how we determine the president in the United States. I doubt the Democrats are actually planning to write an autopsy after this election, but I think they perhaps should think about it, because I don't think this was the victory that many expected, myself included. And I do think there are some potentially disturbing trends for the Democrats going forward. And I think I'll wrap up there. I have a couple other things, but time's running short, so let's get to the Q&A. Thank you very much.
All right, Ebru.
Yes, thank you
The
very
floor is
much.
yours.
Thank you very much. I mean, I really enjoyed all the talks, and you know, we really covered, I mean, with this great panel of experts, we covered like almost all different aspects of US foreign policy as well as domestic politics. And there are very interesting questions. Just before the questions that were like posted on the chat box, may I just kind